Malaysia has witnessed significant changes in its economic reform and poverty reduction. At the time of independence in 1957, Malaysia was a low-income country, predominantly involved in agriculture and rural economy. Around half of the country's households were living below the national poverty line, with very little changes until 1970, at which 49% of households were poor. By 1995, Malaysia's poverty rate had fallen below 10% in 2007 to less than 5% and subsequently to a mere 0.4% in 2016. In Malaysia, inequality between the major ethnic groups have long been a central development issue. When the country achieved its independence in 1957, there were already sizable inequalities between these groups, and this widened further between 1957 and 1970. In 1970, the population of Malaysia was about 53% Malay, 36% Chinese, and 11% Indian. Yet Bumiputra held only 2.4% of all shares in the stock market, whereas the non-Bumiputra held 34.3%, with the bulk more than 63% in foreign hands. Naturally, disparity between the economic power of an ethnic minority and the disadvantaged position of the majority ethnic group is a potential source of political instability. Mounting tensions between groups broke out into riots during 1969, triggered by severe losses of the ruling government in the 1969 general election, where they lost more than half of the majority votes. The new economic policy was the immediate product of the racial economic clashes in May 13, 1969, following the election results of the May general election. Since its inception, the NEP has made substantial progress towards its objectives. Since 1970 onwards, all ethnic groups witnessed substantial reductions in poverty. At the same time, the Bumiputra increased their share of equity, along with increased share of employment in modern, high-productivity industries, and their average household incomes rose relative to both Chinese and Indian households. While the national poverty rate is extremely low by historical standards, substantial state differences can be seen. It's well known that a large number of poor households are centered in rural Sabah and Sarawak, especially that of the indigenous communities, as well as in the rural areas of Terengganu, Kelantan, and Kedah. The number of listed urban poor in Selangor is also quite notable. While poverty has significantly decreased in the Peninsular Malaysia since independence, the rise of urbanisation has led the concentration of urban poor to also increase in tandem. Due to rapid economic growth, Malaysia have transformed into an urban and industrialised nation. From a country that is primarily based on the export of raw materials, rubber and tin, Malaysia have evolved to one that is among the strongest, most diversified and fastest growing in the ASEAN region. Yet the challenge of the urbanisation has also hit the nation. Urban poverty in Malaysia has been considered as an increasingly visible phenomenon due to impacts of urbanisation. As for East Malaysia, the indigenous people represent the majority, which include native Kadazan Dusun, Bajau and Murut in Sabah, as well as native Iban, Bidayuh and Melanau in Sarawak. According to official estimates, the ethnic composition is given as 69.1% Bumiputra, 23% Chinese, 6.9% Indians and 1% others. Poverty pocket in Malaysia is largely contributed by the indigenous communities, especially in Sabah and Sarawak. Meanwhile, the poverty rates remain high for the Orang Asli in Peninsular Malaysia, 34% of whom remain below the poverty line. Bumiputra community are still the country's poorest, with a high absolute poverty incidence of 7.2% in 2019, compared to the Chinese of 1.4% and Indians of 4.8%. With all being said, the COVID-19 pandemic has further exacerbated the case of poverty in Malaysia. The number of unemployed persons went up to 826,000 individuals in May this year, the highest in 27 years. Malaysia's unemployment rate peaked at unprecedented level in May 2020, as the job market was affected by the poor business during the movement control order. Based on the Department of Statistics survey related to effects of COVID-19 on companies and business firms, around 42.5% companies and business firms required more than 6 months to recover. While the unemployment rate has since increased at a slower pace, the record high numbers of retrenched workers mean many households will be impacted. Although booming gig economy provided employment alternative for the retrenched workers, the lack of social security will further jeopardize the economic situation of the impacted households. Additionally, the country has recently reviewed the country's poverty line income, PLI. The PLI has been revised from a monthly household income of 980 ringgit to 2,208 ringgit, at once pushing up the country's poverty rate from 0.4% in 2016 to 5.6% last year. Moving out of poverty may be a temporary progress. Economic shocks as COVID-19 pandemic may rob those who have escaped poverty from their hard-won gains and force them back into poverty. Also, with the revision of the national poverty line income, those who are already classified as escaped poverty may find themselves being sucked into the poverty trap yet again. The COVID-19 pandemic disruptive nature is undeniable. It has direct impact on the economy and the quality of life of the general population. Adding to the impact of COVID-19 is the restriction to movements that have sent shockwaves through the global supply chain and consequently dampened demand. As economic deprivation will be amplified during the time of lockdown, proper allocation of the government's welfare and social assistance may help prevent the poorest community to be in neglect due to poor access to health care. For the privileged, the restriction of movement is just a minor adjustment in their daily life. Yet for most of the poor, the partial lockdown may be a deprivation of income or even a matter of life and death.